A man buys a $2 photo at an antique shop on a hunch he can't explain. But when he zooms in to check the details, he gets the shock of his life. The scent of old wood and rusted iron hung thick in the air as Randy Garrett stepped into the dimly lit antique shop tucked away in a quiet corner of Fresno, California. It was the kind of place that held secrets of the past, but people were often too busy to step inside and look around. It was the kind of place that Randy loved, though, a treasure trove of forgotten memories, dust-covered trinkets, and time-worn relics. The treasure hunter had visited hundreds of these shops over the years, driven by a collector's intuition and a thirst for the unknown. It wasn't about finding something rare or valuable, it was about the thrill of the hunt. But he had no idea that today would change his life forever. He wandered aimlessly through the cluttered aisles, taking it all in. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, but certain items had a way of catching his eye. Randy rarely knew what he wanted to buy until he laid his eyes on something that spoke to him. He trusted his instincts to find something good. The items in the antique shop seemed never-ending, but nothing was attracting his attention until a weathered cardboard box in the corner caught his eye. It wasn't particularly interesting in itself, but inside were a stack of old tintype photographs. Randy had a weak spot for old photos. There was something about getting a small snapshot into the past that intrigued him. If the photos contained people, it was even more exciting. He loved thinking about the kind of lives the people may have had, the jobs they might have done, the things they talked about. As Randy sifted through them, one image in particular stood out to him. He couldn't place exactly what it was that had made him stop at that photograph, but it was that tingling instinct that was speaking to him, the one that told him this was the thing he needed to walk away from the shop with. It was a 4x5-inch black and white tintype showing a group of people outside a rustic barn, some frozen mid-action with what looked like croquet mallets in hand. It was charming, curious, and almost surreal. The figures were hard to make out with the naked eye. The photo seemed to have been taken from a distance, but it seemed as though most of the subjects were looking toward the photographer. What was it about this scene that had made someone want to capture it? Judging by the clothes, Randy guessed the photo had to have been taken in the 19th century. Photography was still in its infancy then, and he could only imagine the big, bulking equipment the photographer had used to capture this moment in time. Randy's fingers twitched with excitement as he held on to the photo. There was no way he was leaving the store without it. The shop owner noticed his interest and called out, "That box? All photos are $2. $2. That was all." Randy pulled the last of his cash from his wallet and bought the photo without hesitation. He didn't know it yet, but he just purchased a piece of American history. That night, back home with his wife Linda, Randy placed the photo under his microscope. "Look at this," he murmured, motioning her over. Linda leaned in, squinting at the haunting faces that seemed to draw Randy's attention. Together, they scanned the photo, taking in each of the people and wondering what had happened to them all. Who were they? Why were they gathered there? Why were they having their photo taken in such a moment? Each figure seemed frozen in time, suspenders hanging loosely from shoulders, wide-brimmed hats casting shadows over wary eyes. Their stances were casual, yet there was something enigmatic in the way they held themselves. Most of them were turned to the camera, acknowledging that someone was there to capture this moment in time. It had all the hallmarks of a 19th century photo, which often appeared haunting. Then, suddenly, Randy froze. His hand, still adjusting the microscope, stopped abruptly. He pulled back, his expression contorting into something between disbelief and confusion. Linda immediately turned toward him. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Randy furrowed his brow, hesitating for a moment as if afraid to voice what was on his mind. "I thought I recognized someone in the photo, but that's impossible. There's just no way it could have happened." Linda raised an eyebrow, thoroughly puzzled. "Recognize someone?" she repeated. "Randy, this photo is over 100 years old. You didn't exactly go to school with these people." He gave a dry laugh, but didn't look away from the image. I know. It sounds crazy, but I'm telling you, for a split second, it was like I knew that face. There's something about the eyes, the posture. It jolted me." Linda rolled her eyes slightly, though not unkindly. This was typical of Randy. He had a habit of letting his imagination run wild when it came to his collectibles. She chalked it up to another case of Randy's photo fever, a term she'd playfully coined over the years. But still, something in his voice made her pause. He wasn't joking. He was genuinely shaken. Randy turned back to the microscope, adjusting the focus again, this time narrowing in on the one figure that had disturbed him so deeply. He zoomed in further, the image sharpening, revealing more minute detail. Each wrinkle of fabric, each fleck of dust on the lens, each creased expression etched into history. And then his breath caught. His heart thudded against his ribcage as the realization struck. The moment felt surreal, like waking up mid-dream and not knowing which world was real. He looked up at Linda, his face now pale, eyes wide with disbelief. His wife could tell he'd got the shock of his life. "Linda, just take a look," he said, almost in a whisper. "You do realize who that is, don't you?" He motioned for her to sit and offered the seat at the microscope, his hand trembling slightly. Linda hesitated, then moved closer, more out of curiosity than conviction. She leaned in and peered through the eyepiece. And within seconds, her gasp filled the quiet room. Her hand shot to her mouth. She leaned in again, blinking, trying to reconcile what she was seeing. "Oh my God," she breathed, "that's Billy the Kid." Randy said, voice quivering with awe, confirming the impossible truth now staring back at them both. The room fell into an eerie silence for a few moments. The only sound, the faint hum of the old ceiling fan above them. There, standing among the group, clear as day, was the infamous outlaw, Henry McCarty, better known as Billy the Kid. His unmistakable face, youthful yet hardened, was framed by the shadow of his hat. He held a croquet mallet casually at his side, a small smirk playing at his lips, as if caught mid-joke. And around him, Randy was now certain, stood several other figures whose identities began to piece together like a historical jigsaw puzzle. The distinctive features, clothing, and known photos from archives all suggested these were not ordinary men. They were members of the Lincoln County Regulators, the notorious posse that had carved a place in Wild West legend. The juxtaposition was almost surreal. Cold-blooded gunmen immortalized in a moment of frivolity, playing croquet on a sunlit patch of grass. The violent reputations of these men stood in stark contrast to the leisure captured in the image, and it made the photograph all the more haunting. Randy sat back in his chair, reeling. "Linda, do you know what this means? There's only one known photo of Billy the Kid until now." She nodded slowly, still unable to tear her eyes away from the microscope. "That photo sold for millions, Randy. And this one? It's not just him. It's him with the Regulators. It's a whole scene, not just a portrait. It's living history." "I know," he said, barely able to believe it himself. "I know." That night, Randy could barely sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over in his mind. The face, the stance, the unmistakable glint in the eyes of the man in that old tintype photo. He wasn't thinking about fame or fortune, not even for a second. The thought of how much the photograph might be worth hadn't even crossed his mind. For Randy, this wasn't about money. It was about history, raw, real, and unexpectedly alive in his hands. A forgotten moment, preserved and found by pure chance in an unassuming antique shop, and bought for just $2. But as dawn broke and the buzz of excitement remained, Randy's sense of wonder began to collide with reality. He knew he needed to validate what he'd seen. He needed answers. By mid-morning, he had a list. Historians, professors, collectors, anyone with even the faintest link to Old West history. He made call after call, sending emails, attaching scanned copies of the photograph, eagerly explaining what he believed he had found. But instead of intrigue or interest, he was met with scoffs, dismissals, and abrupt hang-ups. Billy the Kid only has one known photo, they'd tell him flatly, taken in 1880 at Fort Sumner. If you think you found another, you're either mistaken or you're trying to pull a scam. Randy tried to explain the context, but the experts didn't want to hear it. Some accused him of digital forgery. Others claimed it was a staged reproduction, a common trick in the collectibles world. He even had one historian laugh and say, "You're the 10th guy this year who thinks he's found Billy the Kid." It was a crushing blow. Linda watched as the man who had been so animated the night before now looked deflated, like the wind had been knocked out of his sails. "Maybe we just need to try another approach," she said gently. "We don't need them to believe us right away. We just need one person to take a real look." Her words sparked a renewed fire in Randy. He wasn't giving up. He couldn't. The image haunted him. It felt too important, too rare, too full of truths that hadn't yet been uncovered. They decided to go deeper. If no one would take their word for it, they'd gather the evidence themselves. They consulted old historical records and compared facial features using early facial recognition technology. They pored over maps, comparing the terrain in the background of the photo to known locations tied to Billy the Kid. They matched clothing styles and scrutinized shadows and light angles to determine the time of day and season. They even traced the history of antique croquet sets, hoping that one seemingly insignificant detail could become a turning point in proving authenticity. Then finally came the breakthrough they'd been hoping for. Kagan's Inc., a renowned numismatics and Americana firm based in San Francisco, responded to Randy's inquiry. Unlike the others, they didn't immediately dismiss his claims. They agreed to at least look at the photograph. For Randy and Linda, it was a glimmer of hope. When they met with David McCarthy, Kagan's senior numismatist, the atmosphere was cautious, even a little tense. McCarthy was polite but reserved. His reputation had been built on rigorous standards and unimpeachable authentication work, and he made it clear he wasn't one to be easily convinced. "I'll be honest," he said, lifting the photo with gloved hands and inspecting it carefully. "An original Billy the Kid photo is the holy grail of Western Americana. You don't just stumble upon something like that in a $2 box." Linda smiled knowingly. "Except that's exactly what happened," she told him, full of conviction. McCarthy chuckled softly, but there was a flicker of intrigue behind his eyes. He set the photo down on the light table and began a slow, meticulous inspection. What was supposed to be a brief meeting turned into hours of conversation. McCarthy asked questions, took measurements, studied the photographic medium, and noted the composition. He asked for any supporting documents, stories, or other photos that might help date and locate the image. After days of analysis, McCarthy finally admitted something few experts dared to say aloud. "There's something about this photo that makes me pause. It doesn't immediately scream fake." And with that, Randy and Linda were invited into an unprecedented journey, one that would ultimately take over a year. McCarthy and his team conducted an in-depth analysis, assembling a panel of historians, photographic experts, facial recognition analysts, and even forensic geographers. Every detail in the photograph was scrutinized, from the grain of the wood on the barn to the buttons on the men's coats to the patterns of light and shadows across the ground. More importantly, Kagan's approached the photo from a place of skepticism, not to prove Randy right, but to try to prove him wrong. And when they couldn't, piece by piece, the photo began to pass every test they threw at it. They analyzed the image's tintype composition and confirmed it dated to the late 1870s. They digitally overlaid the known photo of Billy the Kid, examining key facial markers, jawline curvature, ear shape, nose bridge, and orbital spacing. The match was uncanny. Then, the regulators, known members of Billy's posse, began to emerge from the background. And perhaps most chilling of all, the croquet mallets, which had initially seemed almost comical, turned out to be a detail corroborated in a forgotten diary belonging to a woman named Sally Chisholm, a known associate of the regulators who just happened to be in the photo too. In Sally's diary, she'd written about a gathering at John Tunstall's ranch where she, Billy, and the regulators played croquet in the summer of 1878. The scene matched Randy's photo perfectly, right down to the antique croquet set captured in the background. That also meant that Randy's photo predated the only other authenticated photo of Billy the Kid by 2 years. In this new photo, Billy would have only been 19 years old, but already deep in his outlaw lifestyle. As McCarthy would later say in a statement, simple resemblance is not enough in a case like this. We had to answer where, when, how, and why this photograph was taken. And after more than a year of study, the overwhelming evidence pointed to one conclusion: it's authentic. For Randy and Linda, validation wasn't just sweet, it was a vindication of their instincts, their perseverance, and their unshakable belief in the story that photograph told. What had started as a casual afternoon stroll through an antique store had now evolved into one of the greatest historical discoveries of modern times. The photo that cost Randy $2 was now valued at a staggering $5 million. The story exploded when National Geographic stepped in. They launched a 2-hour documentary titled Billy the Kid: New Evidence, narrated by Kevin Costner. The world watched in fascination as Randy's humble $2 purchase turned into a historic treasure. Throughout the film, experts dissected the photo, comparing the facial structure, the period clothing, and even analyzing the croquet mallets to verify authenticity. The combination of science, history, and passion painted a vivid portrait of the Wild West and gave Randy and Linda the validation they'd fought so hard for. Finally, a prestigious auction house in California set the photo's opening bid at $5 million. But for Randy, it was never just about the money. "We could use a new truck," he admitted in an interview, chuckling, "but we'd really love to keep looking for lost pieces of history. The hunt is the real joy." So next time you're in a dusty little antique store, rifling through old photographs or rusted trinkets, remember this: the past is always around. Sometimes all it takes is $2 and a second glance. What would you have done in Randy's position? Have you ever found an interesting item in an antique store? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.